I'll use names not in that list. Mara, narrator, Owen, brother, Aunt Frances, cousin Jamie, friend Sid, venue manager Cass. All clear. Now writing the full story. My name is Mara, and I am 31 years old, and the night my family chose to make an example of me in front of everyone they had ever wanted to impress, I was wearing a pale green dress I bought specifically because my mother said green was her favorite color. She did not mention that when she stood up. It was a Sunday evening in late March, and my parents had rented out the private dining room at Hargrove's, the kind of restaurant that puts a candle on every table and charges $12 for bread. 26 relatives were there, aunts, uncles, my father's college friends who had folded themselves into the extended family over the years, my brother Owen looking at his phone. My parents told me it was a celebration dinner. I had just been promoted to senior compliance analyst at Whitmore Group, the largest commercial property management firm in our region, and they said they wanted the family to hear about it together. I actually believed that. I drove 40 minutes, brought a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford, hugged people I hadn't seen since the last mandatory gathering, and sat in the chair directly across from my mother. We were between the appetizers and the entrees when she stood up. She tapped her fork against her glass the way people do at weddings, and the whole room quieted, and I remember thinking, this is nice. She's really doing this? She looked around at everyone with the particular expression she saves for moments she has rehearsed. Then she said, I've asked everyone here tonight because this family has been carrying a weight, and it's time we dealt with it openly. The weight was me. She listed things, the money they had spent on my college, the years I had lived in their house between jobs, the times I had, in her words, taken without giving back. She talked about family loyalty and what it looks like when someone consistently puts themselves first. She used the phrase financial drain. She said it twice, which told me she had practiced. My father sat through it like a man watching a presentation he had already approved. Owen glanced up from his phone once, looked back down. Nobody stopped her. When she finished, there was a kind of silence that has a specific texture, the silence of 26 people deciding whether to look at you or away from you. Most of them chose away. My mother sat down and picked up her fork, as if that was simply an item on the agenda, as if she had just cleared something up. I had two options in that moment, and I knew it with perfect clarity. I could let them see me crack. Give them the tears and the shaking voice and the please listen, that's not fair. Or I could do the thing I had learned to do in every high-pressure compliance review I'd ever sat through. I could go very still. So I went very still. I set my napkin on the table. I pushed back my chair with both hands, the way you do when you want the movement to be deliberate and not rushed. I picked up my jacket and my bag. I looked at my mother, just once, long enough that she would remember I looked at her. Then I walked out through the private dining room, past the hostess stand, and out into the parking lot where the cold air hit my face like a correction. I sat in my car for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I watched the dashboard clock. Then I drove home. On the way, I called my friend Sid, the kind of friend who picks up on the second ring and doesn't perform sympathy. She just listens. I told her everything while I was still moving. Still in my coat, still in the pale green dress that my mother said was her favorite color. When I finished, Sid said one thing. What exactly do they think you took from them? I didn't have a clean answer, and that bothered me more than anything my mother had said in that room, because I am the kind of person who likes clean answers. I build compliance frameworks for a living. I find the gaps. I document the risk. I track what flows where and what stops when a system fails. So that night, I sat at my kitchen table and I did what I do. I started tracking. Here is what I should have told that dining room. My parents own a mid-sized property management company called Varden Holdings, 12 residential buildings, 2 mixed-use commercial properties, and a handful of long-term lease agreements with small business tenants. My father started it 20 years ago on a handshake and a credit line. My mother handles client relationships, which is a polite way of saying she takes people to lunch and believes that warmth is a substitute for documentation. Owen is listed as operations director. He has been operations director for 4 years. He has a card that says operations director and an office on the second floor with a nice chair. I am listed as nothing because I was never officially part of the company. I was just the daughter who answered when something went wrong. The first time I stepped in, I was 24. I had just started my second year at Whitmore Group, still learning the architecture of commercial compliance, and my parents called me because a city inspector had cited one of their buildings for missing fire suppression documentation on a recent renovation. The fine was significant. The deadline to cure the violation was 10 days. My father said, "We don't know who to call." I spent a weekend assembling the paper trail the inspector needed, tracked down the original contractor's certificate of insurance, submitted the response packet, and followed up every 2 days until the violation was formally cleared. My mother thanked me by telling her sister that she was glad Owen was so good at handling things. I let it go. I thought it was a one-time help. It was not a one-time help. Over the next 6 years, I became the invisible floor under Varden Holdings. Not officially, not with compensation, not even with consistent acknowledgement, but functionally, completely. I reviewed every lease renewal for liability language before my parents signed them. I built the property risk assessment templates they now use without knowing I wrote them. When the city revised habitability standards for rental units, I created a compliance checklist for each of their 12 residential buildings and walked their property manager through it. When a commercial tenant disputed a clause about maintenance responsibility and threatened to escalate, I drafted the formal response that made the dispute go away. I reviewed their liability insurance coverage every year at renewal and twice caught gaps that would have left them exposed on large claims. I caught a contractor invoice that was double billed across 2 properties. I flagged a tenant who had quietly subletting against lease terms before it became a legal problem. I did all of this from my own apartment on weeknights and weekends without billing a single hour. Because they were my parents, and that was what you did. That was the story I told myself for 6 years. The night of the dinner, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at that story with fresh eyes, and I understood it was not generosity. It was a habit, and the habit had been so convenient for everyone else that it had quietly been mistaken for obligation. I opened a new folder on my desktop. I named it Varden Transition. The next morning was a Monday. I did not call my parents. I did not call Owen. I went to work, sat at my desk, and spent my lunch break building a document I can only describe as the most thorough thing I have ever produced in my personal life, and I have built compliance packages that ran to 300 pages. I called it Operational Handoff Varden Holdings. Every system, subscription, and active obligation that still carried my name, my email, my professional credentials, or my personal card. Every renewal deadline in the next 60 days. Every regulatory filing that had my contact information on record with the city. Every vendor who called my cell when they couldn't reach the office. The list was 22 items long. I looked at it for a while. Not because I was second-guessing myself, but because 22 is a number that tells a story, and that story was not the one my mother had told at dinner. That morning, I also had a message from Owen. "Mom's upset that you left without saying anything. You made it worse." I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down and went back to my list. My aunt on my father's side, Aunt Frances, texted me mid-afternoon. She was at the dinner. She had been seated at the far end of the table, the end where people go when they are family, but not close enough to the center of things to matter in the performance. Her message was 4 words. "Are you doing okay?" That was it. 4 words. No taking sides. No cleaned-up version of what happened. Just the question nobody in my immediate family had thought to ask. I typed back, "I think I will be." She replied, "Good." For the record, I was embarrassed to be there. That meant more than she probably knew. On Tuesday evening, I sent the email, subject line, Varden Holdings, Operational Account Transition. I addressed it to my father, my mother, and their property manager, a steady, overworked woman named Cass who had been quietly holding the administrative center of the company together for 3 years and deserved significantly better than she got. I wrote that I was stepping back from all informal operational support roles connected to Varden Holdings, effective immediately. I attached the handoff document. I explained that any accounts currently tied to my personal card would be removed over the next 7 days. Any matters where my name appeared as regulatory or insurance contact would need to be transferred to ownership. I was professional. I was complete. I did not mention the dinner. I ended with, all information needed to manage these transitions is included in the attached document. Nothing in this handoff requires my continued involvement, only your attention. I hit send and closed my laptop and made dinner like it was a normal night. 40 minutes later, Owen called. I let it go to voicemail. Mara, come on. You're overreacting to one bad night and now you're trying to blow up the company? Mom is already crying. Dad says if you want to be done with this family, fine, but don't take it out on people who work there. Call me back. I listened to it once, saved it to a folder, did not call back. My mother's text arrived an hour after that. I said what needed to be said and now you're punishing everyone. This is exactly the problem. The problem. Of course I was the problem. I had been the problem at the dinner and I was the problem now. The only constant in both equations being me. And somehow that still didn't raise any questions for her. I put my phone on the charger and went to bed. Wednesday morning, Cass called me from the office line. She never called me from the office line. The fact that she did told me everything I needed to know before I picked up. Mara, she said, and her voice had that texture that only appears when someone has been managing other people's anxiety since before 8 a.m. and is now reaching the end of their ability to absorb it. She said, the city sent a notice yesterday about the Fairlane Avenue building. The habitability reinspection is scheduled for next Friday, and they're asking for the updated egress documentation and the revised common area signage checklist. Your mother told them you'd handle the response. I didn't know how to tell her. I cut in gently. I told her the handoff document had the egress folder path on page 3, the signage checklist on page 5, and the city contact information on page 7. I told her the documents were complete and already formatted for submission. All they needed to do was attach and send. There was a pause. Then Cass said, very quietly, they haven't opened the email. Of course they hadn't. I told her it wasn't her problem to solve and I was sorry she was in the middle of it. She said no, don't apologize, and then she said something that I thought about for days afterward. She said, I knew you were doing a lot behind the scenes. I just didn't know it was this much. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and let that settle. She knew. Cass knew. The person paid to manage the day-to-day operations of the company knew that I was doing structural work that wasn't mine to do. She just hadn't said it out loud. I wondered how many other people had known and said nothing. On Thursday, my father called. Not a text. A call, which from him means the situation has moved past the phase where he could still control it through message editing. He opened with, I understand you're upset, which is the version of an apology that contains no apology but expects to be received as one. I said, I'm not upset. I'm finished. He said, what does that mean? It means what the email said. I'm no longer available as an informal operational resource for the company. He said, that's not Mara. We are your family. Yes, I said. And last Sunday, in front of 26 people, my family called me a financial drain. So I wanted to give everyone a clear look at what it actually costs when I stop draining. Silence. Then, you're being vindictive. I said I sent a complete handoff document with every active account, deadline, and point of contact, dated and organized. That is the opposite of vindictive. That is professionalism, which is something I gave this company for free for 6 years. More silence. A longer kind. Then he said, the Fairlane inspection is next Friday. I know, I said. He said, we need the egress documentation. It's in the attachment. Page 3. He said, I don't understand those systems. And the kindest and most truthful thing I could say to him in that moment was, that is not my problem to fix anymore, Dad. I hung up and stood at my window for a while, looking at nothing. feeling the strange, specific weight of a door you've decided to close. Aunt Frances called on Friday evening. She said my mother had been telling people a version of events in which I had some kind of breakdown at the dinner, stormed out, and was now sabotaging the family company out of jealousy toward Owen. I thanked her for telling me. She said, "I want you to know I'm not repeating it, and I told your Uncle Hank the truth because he was already starting to believe her." Then she asked, "Is there going to be some kind of family meeting?" I said I didn't know. I said I wasn't sure I owed anyone a meeting. She said, "That's fair. But if there is one, you should bring the paperwork." Aunt Frances had been an office manager for 30 years. She understood immediately what kind of conversation changes when paper enters the room. I said, "Already planned." She said, "Good girl," and hung up. My father called a family meeting. He framed it as a mediation, which is what people say when they want to appear reasonable while still controlling the room. He asked me to come to the house on Saturday afternoon. He said the family deserved a chance to resolve things face to face. I almost didn't go. I talked to Sid about it on Thursday night, both of us eating takeout on the floor of her apartment, and she said the same thing Aunt Frances had essentially said from a different direction. Go, but go on your own terms, not theirs. I went. There were about 15 people in my parents' living room when I arrived. Some from the dinner, some who had only heard about it secondhand through the family's particular telephone network, which moves about 3 times faster than actual news and contains roughly half as much fact. Owen was there with his arms crossed, which is his body language for defensive, before anything has been said yet. My father stood near the fireplace in the posture of a man who has decided to appear measured. My mother sat in the chair by the window with the expression of someone who believes the moral clarity is on her side and has already decided the meeting will confirm it. I sat down. I did not take my coat off. I put my folder on my knees. My father opened with a version of events that described everything that had happened since Sunday as overreaction. The dinner was an emotional moment. I had responded to a difficult conversation by endangering the livelihoods of people who worked for the company. He said, "This family needs to get back to what matters," which was the kind of sentence that sounds like warmth while carrying a very specific instruction inside it. I waited until he was finished. Then I opened the folder and started passing documents around the room. Not to my parents, to everyone else. "This is the operational account transfer document I sent on Tuesday," I said. It lists 22 systems, accounts, and active obligations connected to Varden Holdings that were being managed under my name, my credentials, or my personal card, without compensation and without formal acknowledgement. Aunt Frances took the first copy. Cousin Jamie, who worked in finance and had a good nose for numbers, took another. 2 of my father's college friends who had been in business long enough to understand what they were looking at took theirs without comment and immediately started reading. My mother said, "This is not the point." I said, "It is the exact point because you told 26 people I was a financial drain on this family, so let's be specific about what that means." I walked through it calmly. The lease reviews, the compliance filings, the insurance gap I caught 2 years ago that would have exposed them to a 7-figure liability claim if a tenant had slipped on the front steps of the Birchwood property during that winter when the property manager called out sick and nobody had arranged snow removal. I told them what the potential claim amount was. I said it clearly enough that the 2 business people in the room made the same small face people make when a number clarifies something that had been abstract before. Owen said, "You're making it sound like Dad and I weren't doing anything." I looked at him. I said, "I'm not saying what you did or didn't do. I'm saying what I did. With dates. Those are just the facts." He started in on something about how families pool effort and nobody keeps score, and I sounded like I was auditioning for a courtroom, and I let him talk until he hit a natural pause. Then I said, "Owen, who do Cass and the vendors call when there's a compliance question?" He blinked. "Who did the city inspector's office have on file as the response contact for Fairlane Avenue?" He opened his mouth. "Who built the risk assessment templates you've been using for 3 years?" He closed it. My father tried to redirect. He said this was not about who did what, it was about what we do from here. He said families are not balance sheets. He said he hoped I could hear that they were sorry the dinner went the way it did. Not sorry for what was said, sorry for how it went. The passive construction of an apology offered by people who are not ready to own the thing they are apologizing for. My mother had not spoken for several minutes, which for her is extraordinary. Then she said, very carefully, I shouldn't have used the word I used. She didn't say which word, but everyone in the room knew. Cousin Jamie, from the back of the room, said quietly, it was a bad word to use, Aunt Susan. The fact that a 24-year-old said that to my mother's face and my mother didn't argue told me the room had moved. I said, I need one thing from tonight. Not an apology, not a plan, just accuracy. I need you to tell these people, the same people you told the other version to, what the documents show. My father looked at the floor. My mother said, you didn't drain this family. Her voice was flat, the flatness of a concession made because the alternative was worse, but she said it in front of the room, with the paperwork on their laps. I said, thank you. Then I stood up and put the folder in my bag. My father said, the Fairlane inspection is still next Friday. I know, I said. He said, Cass is overwhelmed. I said, everything she needs is in the document. It's been there since Tuesday. Someone just needs to read it. Owen said, so that's it? You walk out again? I stopped at the door and turned around, because some things deserve to be said while looking at the person you are saying them to. I said, I walked out once because I was humiliated. I'm leaving now because I'm done. Those are not the same thing, and eventually the difference might matter to you. Then I left. The Fairlane inspection happened on Friday. My parents scrambled. Cass read the document, finally, properly, on her own, and submitted the egress packet and signage checklist the morning before the deadline. The inspection passed. Barely, with a note in the record about the late submission window. It was not a disaster, it was, however, a preview. Over the following weeks, the things I used to quietly manage started developing the kind of small pressure fractures that only show up when nobody is watching for them. A lease renewal for one of the commercial tenants went out without the updated liability language I had been revising for 2 years. The tenant's attorney noticed immediately and flagged 4 clauses for renegotiation. My father spent 2 weeks managing a negotiation that should have taken 2 days. A vendor who had been on a handshake arrangement with Barden Holdings for years asked for a proper certificate of insurance after a near-miss incident on a property, the kind of COI request that should take an hour and instead took 11 days because nobody knew where the policy documents were kept. I had kept them in a shared folder I had noted in the handoff on page 2. The city's routine audit of rental property habitability certifications flagged 2 of their 12 buildings for incomplete records. Nothing severe, but incomplete records create timelines, and timelines create costs, and both of those things are visible in a way that charm does not fix. 3 months after the dinner, Barden Holdings was still operating. That is the truth, and I want to be precise about it because my point was never to destroy something people's paychecks depended on. My point was something quieter and, I think, more honest. My point was, here is what this cost. Here is what you called a drain. Here is what happens to the water level when you remove what you said was nothing. Owen texted me 6 weeks after the Saturday meeting. A long one, not his usual style. He wrote about being stressed, about my father not understanding the operations side of things, about my mother telling vendors that staffing issues were the reason for the delays, when really it was paperwork. Buried near the bottom, he wrote, I know you did more than I did. I've always kind of known that. I just didn't say it because saying it felt like losing something. I read that line 4 times. Not because it was enough. It wasn't enough. It was a private admission sent in a text that nobody else would see, and that is a very specific kind of honesty that people offer when they want credit for the truth without paying the full cost of speaking it out loud. But it told me something. He knew. He had always known. The myth was never that I was invisible. The myth was that visible would threaten the story they had all agreed to tell. I didn't write back that day. I sat with it. Eventually I sent, thanks for saying it. That was all. My mother called me in May 2 months later. not to argue. Her voice had something in it I had not heard before. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of armor. She said she had been thinking about the word she used. She said it in front of people and she knew that mattered. She did not apologize with the architecture I would have needed to walk back through that door. But she was speaking, and she was not performing, and that was new. I said, I hear you. I did not say, it's okay, because it wasn't okay. It was a real thing that happened in a green dress, in a restaurant that charges $12 for bread, in front of 26 people, and those things don't get erased by a phone call in May. But I said, I hear you, and I meant it. And Francis still checks in. Cousin Jamie sends me articles about property law that he finds interesting, which is a love language I genuinely respect. Cass left Varden Holdings in April for a position at a larger firm and sent me a message that just said, the handoff document you wrote is still the best organized file I have ever worked from. Thank you for making it so clean. That one made me actually laugh. I want to say something true about what the last year has been. I did not walk out of that dinner and immediately feel powerful. I felt a particular kind of quiet grief that comes from finally understanding that a relationship you wanted to be one thing has always been another. The family I thought I was preserving by being useful was not being preserved. It was being maintained, managed, kept functional. The way you maintain a structure you're not sure you're allowed to renovate. I spent a lot of nights being sad about that. Not about the dinner. The dinner was almost a mercy once enough time passed. I was sad about the years before it. All the weekends I spent on lease paperwork instead of my own life. All the times I overrode my own exhaustion because a deadline had appeared and I was the only one who understood what it meant. I was sad about what I had called love that had actually been compliance. But here is the other true thing. I am 31 years old. And for the first time in my adult life, I know exactly what I give to the people around me. I give it by choice. I give it with my eyes open. I give it to people who would also give it back. That is not a small thing. My parents did organize a meeting to make an example of me in front of everyone they wanted to impress. They picked the person who knew where every liability lived, every deadline ran, every renewal was due. They told her to leave. And she finally listened. I didn't end their business. I didn't expose anything, hack anything, or tell a story I hadn't lived. I simply stopped being what they had arranged their convenience around, and then I let reality do what reality always does when you remove the thing that had been quietly holding it in place. They started calling in a panic, more calls than I could count. Not because I had broken anything. Because for the first time, they had to carry it themselves. And if that is the most complete kind of correction a family like mine can receive, then I can live with that. I can more than live with it. I drove home in the green dress that night, and the plan built itself piece by piece in the silence of the car, and it turned out it wasn't a plan for revenge at all. It was just the first night I finally stopped lying to myself about what I was worth. There's something I've been turning over since all of this happened. Not the dinner itself, not even the family meeting, but the quiet months after, when the noise died down and I finally had enough distance to see the whole shape of it. What happened to my family wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a glitch. It was cause and effect, moving the way it always does when people have been protected from the consequences of their own choices for too long. My parents built a habit out of leaning on someone they publicly undervalued, and they got away with it for years because I kept absorbing the cost. The moment I stopped, reality didn't collapse on them like punishment. It just arrived, on schedule, the way it would have arrived much sooner if I hadn't been standing in the way. That's the part I keep coming back to. I wasn't protecting them out of love, not really, not at the end. I was protecting them out of a fear I hadn't named yet. The fear that if I stopped being useful, I would stop belonging. And the cruelest thing about that fear is that it makes you keep earning a place that should have been yours without condition. I think about what it takes to hold a line like the one I held after that dinner, and I want to be honest about it. It wasn't bravery in the cinematic sense. It wasn't one clean moment of clarity. It was 100 small decisions not to go back, not to fix the thing I had already handed off. not to answer the call that came in at 7 in the morning, not to let guilt be dressed up as responsibility and handed to me again. That takes a particular kind of intelligence, not book intelligence, but the harder kind. The kind that requires you to see a situation clearly even when everything around you is applying pressure to see it differently. Owen knew. I think he had known for a long time. The admission he sent me, buried near the bottom of a long text, was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. And I had to sit with the fact that knowing and saying are two entirely separate acts of courage, and that for years everyone around me had chosen the first without the second. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it matters, because the willingness to tell the truth out loud, even when it costs you something, is one of the only things that actually moves people forward. Aunt Frances did it. Cousin Jamie did it. And eventually, in a small and imperfect way, Owen did too. My mother said I didn't drain the family. She said it in a flat voice in a room full of people, because by that point, it was the only thing left to say. It wasn't the apology I would have written, but it was real, and real is rarer than people think. What I know now, at 31, sitting on the other side of all of it, is that the life I was living before that dinner was costing me in ways I hadn't fully measured. Not just time, not just weekends and late evenings, but the slow erosion of understanding my own worth as something separate from what I could produce for someone else. Mara, the name I carried into that restaurant in a green dress, walked out of it with something she hadn't arrived with. Not revenge, not power, just accuracy, about what she gave, about what she was owed, about the difference between belonging to a family and disappearing into one. That accuracy is the thing I would choose to keep, above everything else that came after.